Armed conflict. An armed conflict is a contested incompatibility that concerns government and our territory where the use of armed force between two parties of which at least one is the government of a state results in at least 25 battle-related deaths in one calendar year. An armed conflict simply means a battle between a non-government force and a government force, most of the time, where both party uses guns, cannons, and each, which often results to death. What causes armed conflict? Bad economic conditions seems to be a main cause of internal conflicts. Repressive political systems, especially if they are in a state of transition, are war-prone. Degradations of renewable resources, erosion, deforestation, scarcity of water may contribute to the possibility of armed conflict. Armed conflict often happens mostly because of of bad economic conditions. In this case, armed conflict happens between two countries. Another reason is politics. An example of this is the conflict between our government forces and the NPA. Both may want peace, it's just that their ways do not coincide with each other's visions. So, their beliefs clashes, causing a armed conflict to occur. What are the effects of armed conflict? More than 1 in 10 children worldwide are affected by armed conflict. The effects are both direct and indirect and are associated with an immediate and long-term harm. The direct effects of conflict include death, physical and psychological trauma, and displacement. Armed conflict also have a destructive impact on the social, political, and economic infrastructure of societies, limiting the provisions of basic services, forcing migration flows, and exposing affected communities to risk of death and disease. These consequences last well beyond the cessations of hostilities. Armed conflict often results to the declining of economy, migrations, physical and psychological trauma, and death. The very example of this is the Marawi siege. Because of the battle between the ISIS and the government forces, houses were burned, homes were gone, and lives were lost, causing physical and psychological trauma to people, especially to children. Children affected by the war lost their smiles, and that is a very devastating thing. Three types of conflicts: the international armed conflict, internationalized armed conflict, and the non-international armed conflict. So, international armed conflict is an armed conflict between two or more states. This also serves humanitarian purposes, notably the protections of enemy civilians to the territory of the state that declares war. The use of such declarations of war has become rare. So, international armed conflict, this armed conflict happens between two countries. An example of this was the war between Korea and Japan, which happened a long time ago. Internationalized armed conflict is a civil war characterized by the interventions of armed forces of a foreign power. This form of armed conflict occurs with great frequency and raises many questions of interest to the international lawyer. Internationalized armed conflict. This armed conflict uses the intervention of an armed conflict from foreign power. This type of armed conflict raises questions from international lawyers. And the last one is the non-international armed conflict. Are protracted armed confrontations occurring between governmental armed forces and the forces of one or more armed groups, or between such groups arising on the territory of a state. Non-international armed conflict. This armed conflict happens between a government force and the non-government. One, an example of this is the conflict between the government force and the NPA. To conclude my report, armed conflict happens because of reasons such as economy, politics, and resources. It may be international, internationalized, or a national one. It uses guns which cause casualties and such as homes being lost, physical and psychological trauma are worst of all is death.